What if the defining economic policy of the last decade, a policy that triggered crippling budget cuts, widespread protests, and saved the lives of millions, was all based on a typo? It sounds like impossible, like a conspiracy theory, yet this is the true story of two of the most respected economists in the world. The influential paper they published in a time of crisis, and the simple Excel error that helped unleash a wave of economic policies with multi-trillion-dollar consequences. It's a story about how one flawed idea, armed with the authority of Harvard and the urgency of a global recession, gave governments the intellectual ammunition to inflict years of hardship on their own people. And it's a story about the unlikely hero who exposed it all, a graduate student who was just trying to do his homework. Hi everyone, this is George. Let's see the story here. To understand how a spreadsheet mistake could have such a profound impact, we have to go back to the chaos of 2008. The world was in a free fall. The collapse of Lehman Brothers had sent a shockwave across the planet, triggering the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Banks were falling, stock markets were plummeting, and millions were losing their jobs and homes. In a desperate bid to stop the bleeding, governments around the world intervened. They bailed out banks, slashed interest rates, and pumped trillions of dollars into their economies through stimulus packages. These actions may have prevented a total collapse, but they came at a colossal price. Government debt levels, already high in many countries, began to explode. This set the stage for a monumental battle of ideas that would define the next 10 years. One camp of economists argue for more stimulus, believing that the only way out of the hole was to keep spending to generate growth. In opposition, a different, much older idea was gaining ground: austerity. The argument for austerity is simple. When a household is in debt, it needs to tighten its belt, spend less, and pay back what it owes. So, some economists believed that governments should do the same. They warned that skyrocketing national debt was a ticking time bomb that would eventually lead to economic ruin. The debate raged in parliaments, on cable news, and in the pages of newspapers. Stimulus or austerity? Spend or cut? No one could agree. The world was desperate for a clear answer, for a defining piece of evidence that could settle the argument once and for all. And in the year 2010, it seemed they got one. In January 2010, Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff, two of the most brilliant and respected economists of their generation, published a paper. Both were professors at Harvard University, and their work was considered the gold standard of economic history. Their new paper, titled Growth in a Time of Debt, landed like a thunderbolt in the middle of the global debate. The paper was a massive undertaking analyzing 44 countries over a span of 200 years. Its conclusion was simple, powerful, and utterly terrifying. Reinhart and Rogoff claimed to have found a magic number, a definitive line in the sand. When a country's public debt crossed the threshold of 90% of its gross domestic product, GDP, something catastrophic happened. Economic growth didn't just slow down, it fell off a cliff. Let's quickly break down the term debt to GDP ratio. It's simply a way of comparing a country's total debt to the size of its economy. Think of it like a household's debt compared to its annual income. A ratio of 90% means a country owes nearly as much as its entire economy produces within a year. According to Reinhart and Rogoff, once a country crossed this 90% danger zone, its economy didn't just grow slowly, it shrank. Their data showed that countries with debt above 90% of GDP experienced an average annual growth rate of minus 0.1%. This wasn't presented as a mere correlation. The paper strongly implied a causal link. High debt, they argued, kills growth. For policymakers, this was the smoking gun they had been waiting for. Here, from two of Harvard's finest, was a clear, data-driven argument for immediate and aggressive action. The 90% threshold wasn't just a suggestion. It was presented as an iron law of economics. The message was unmistakable. If you don't want your economy to collapse, you must cut spending. You must embrace austerity. Now, the paper's influence was immediately and immense. It was hailed as a landmark study and provided intellectual cover for politicians who were already ideologically inclined to shrink the size of government. In the United States, Congressman Paul Ryan, then chairman of the House Budget Committee, made the Reinhart-Rogoff study the centerpiece of his budget proposal, calling it conclusive empirical evidence that high debt has a significant negative effect of economic growth. Across the Atlantic, the paper's impact was even more profound. Officials at the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund used it to justify imposing severe austerity measures on countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, which were already reeling from the Eurozone crisis. UK's George Osborne referenced the 90% figure to advocate for his own program of deep spending cuts. The argument was always the same. We have no choice, the data proves it. We must cut or face economic oblivion. So the age of austerity had begun. Powered by the fear of the 90% cliff, governments across the Western world pushed forward with a radical experiment in fiscal contraction. They slashed funding for public services like healthcare, education, and social welfare. They froze public sector wages, cut pensions, and laid off government workers. The logic was that by reducing their deficits, they would restore market confidence, keep interest rates low, and pave the way for a private sector-led recovery. But the recovery never came. Instead, for millions of people, life got demonstrably worse. In Greece, cuts to the healthcare budget were so severe that hospitals ran out of basic supplies. Both in Spain and Greece, youth unemployment soared to over 50%. In the UK, the use of food banks skyrocketed. The social fabric of these nations began to tear. Mass protests erupted in cities from Athens to Madrid, as citizens pushed back against policies they felt were punishing the most vulnerable for a crisis caused by the financial elite. And these measures woke up a monster, the monster of the far right. Proponents of austerity dismissed these as necessary growing pains, insisting that the short-term pain was essential for long-term stability. But other economists were starting to voice serious doubts. They pointed out that slashing government spending in the middle of a recession was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. When consumers and businesses are not spending, the government is often the only source of demand left. Taking that away, they argued, would only deepen the recession, which in turn could make the debt problem even worse, not better. A 2022 study later confirmed that austerity policies made European citizens thousands of euros a year worse off on average, and that countries pursuing the deepest cuts often ended up with higher debt-to-GDP ratios. Critics also began to question the central premise of the Reinhart-Rogoff paper itself. The paper claimed that high debt caused slow growth. But what if it was the other way around? What if slow growth or a major financial crisis was what caused debt to rise in the first place? It's the classic correlation versus causation problem. Does the rooster's crowing cause the sun to rise, or does the sun's rising cause the rooster to crow? Reinhart and Rogoff's work was being used to justify policies that assumed the former, but the evidence was far from clear. Despite these growing criticisms, the 90% rule held sway. It was too simple, too powerful, and too politically convenient to be dislodged by more argument. It had become an article of faith. What it would take to break the spell was not another argument, but cold, hard proof that the foundational claim itself was wrong, and that proof would come from a most unlikely source. The hero of our story is Thomas Herndon. In 2013, Herndon was a 28-year-old economics graduate student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He was not a world-famous professor or a political player. he was, like so many grad students, facing a mountain of homework. For his advanced econometrics class, he was given a seemingly straightforward assignment: take a well-known economics paper and try to replicate its results. The goal was to see if he could arrive at the same conclusions using the same data and methods. Herndon chose growth in a time of debt. He was skeptical of austerity policies and was drawn to the paper that had become their intellectual bedrock. He downloaded the public datasets that Reinhart and Rogoff had used and got to work, expecting to confirm the now famous findings, but he couldn't. No matter how many times he ran the numbers, he could not reproduce the result. He wasn't getting a negative 0.1% growth rate for countries with debt over 90% of GDP. He was getting a positive number, a significant positive number. For weeks, Herndon was baffled. He assumed he was the one making a mistake. These were two of the most eminent economists on the planet. He was just a student. He checked his work again and again, poring over his code and data, convinced he had missed something obvious, but he couldn't find an error. Finally, after consulting with his professors, Michael Ass and Robert Pollin, he took a bold step. He emailed professors Reinhart and Rogoff and politely asked if they could share their original working spreadsheet, so he could figure out what he was doing wrong. To their immense credit, they sent him the Excel file. Herndon opened the spreadsheet, and there on the screen, the truth became horrifyingly clear. It wasn't just one error, it was a perfect storm of mistakes. First, and most famously, there was the Excel error. In one of the key calculations, Reinhart and Rogoff had tried to average the growth rates of 20 countries, but due to a simple coding mistake, the formula they used only included the first 15 countries on the list. The last 5, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, and Denmark, were completely omitted from the average. As it happened, these were countries that had experienced periods of high debt combined with solid economic growth. By accidentally leaving them out, the spreadsheet had dramatically skewed the result downwards. But it got worse. Herndon discovered what he termed selective exclusion. Reinhart and Rogoff had omitted certain years of data from their analysis without explaining why. For instance, they left out data from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand from the post-World War II period, years when these countries had high debt but also strong growth. In the most glaring example, New Zealand, they included only 1 year of data from a period of high debt, 1951, a year that the economy shrunk by 7.6%. They excluded the 4 surrounding years, where debt was also high, but growth was positive. Finally, Herndon found an unconventional weighting of the data. Their methodology gave equal weighting to single-year observations for a country, regardless of how long the country's high debt period lasted. This meant that New Zealand's single bad year had the same impact on the overall average as the United Kingdom's 19 years of high debt and moderate growth. Any one of these errors alone would have been problematic. Altogether, they were devastating. They had interacted to create a completely distorted picture of reality. This discovery was about to send shockwaves through the economics profession and the entire world. It's a powerful reminder that even the most influential ideas deserve scrutiny. If you believe that stories like these, which unpack the hidden data and flawed assumptions that shape our world, are important, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You will not want to miss our next investigation, which is BRICS plus a surprise. Herndon, along with his professors Ass and Pollin, wrote up their findings in their own paper titled "Does High Public Debt Consistently Stifle Economic Growth? A Critique of Reinhart and Rogoff." They corrected the Excel error, included the missing data, and used a standard weighting methodology. And what did they find? The entire 90% cliff vanished. The apocalyptic average growth rate of negative 0.1% was wrong. When properly calculated, the average growth rate for countries with debt-to-GDP ratios over 90% was a positive 2.2%. Let's be clear here, 2.2% growth is not spectacular. It was still lower than the average growth for countries with less debt. The correct data still suggested a negative correlation between very high debt and growth, but the relationship was much weaker, and crucially, there was no evidence of a cliff at 19%. The economic heart attack that Reinhart and Rogoff had diagnosed was in reality more like a mild headache. The argument for inflicting painful austerity to avoid an economic catastrophe was built on a foundation of sand. The fallout was immediate. Herndon's paper became an overnight sensation, shaking the global austerity movement to its core. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman wrote that the affair revealed the extent to which austerity has been sold on false pretenses. The story was a stunning indication of the dangers of unchecked authority and the potential for confirmation bias. Politicians had seized on a study that told them exactly what they wanted to hear, and the global media, for the most part, had failed to question it. Reinhart and Rogoff responded by acknowledging the Excel error, calling it a coding error, while defending their overall conclusion. They argued that even with the correct data, the central point remained that high debt was associated with lower growth. While technically true, this missed the larger point. Their original paper's power came not from showing a gentle slowdown, but from the terror of the 90% cliff and the negative growth that followed. It was that specific, dramatic claim that had been so politically potent, and that claim was now debunked. The story of this spreadsheet error is more than just an embracing episode for a few economists. It's a profound cautionary tale. It shows how a single piece of data, when amplified by respected institutions and wielded by powerful political actors, can have devastating real-world consequences. The austerity policies justified by this flawed paper likely deepened and prolonged the suffering of the Great Recession, leading to job losses, diminished public services, and years of economic stagnation. The deeper lesson is about how we should think about public debt. The idea of a universal danger zone is a myth. Countries are not like households. Japan, for example, has a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 230%, yet it has avoided a full-blown debt crisis. This complex situation is partly explained by the fact that most of its debt is owned domestically, and its central bank keeps borrowing costs extremely low. For countries that can borrow in their own currency, like the US or Japan, the primary economic constraint is often not the threat of bankruptcy, but the risk of inflation. Ultimately, context is everything. Whether high debt is dangerous depends on who owns the debt, what currency it's in, the country's growth rate, and its interest rates. There is no simple one-size-fits-all rule. This entire saga serves as a powerful reminder that we should always question authority and demand transparency. Ideas, especially the big ones that shape policy, must be open to challenge and replication. Because, as this story proves, a simple mistake hidden in the rows and columns of a spreadsheet can be more destructive than any market crash. A silent error whose consequences can echo for a decade, reshaping the lives of millions. See you all in the next video. Bye bye.